All right, let's look at another way that we can solve quadratic equations. We've already looked at solving quadratic equations by factoring and then by extracting square roots. Now we're going to use the idea of extracting square roots in this next technique. It's called solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. Completing the square. All right. Now, in order to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square, here's what you need to remember. You must remember binomial squared factoring, right? So if we have x squared minus 10x plus 25, that this factors to x minus 5 squared, right? Now this is the main piece in understanding how to complete the square, because we are literally completing, what we're doing is we're completing the binomial square is what we're doing, okay? Let me show you how that's going to happen. I want to ask you something. Let's say that we had x squared plus 8x. Now, in order to be able to complete the square, what should be over here? What should the next thing be? It's got to be a plus, we know that for sure, but it's got to be a number, right? What number should be there if you think about binomial squared? It's half of the 8, right? 4, but we don't put a 4 here. What do we have to do with that 4? We got to square it, right? So if we were going to have a binomial squared, then there should be a 16 here, correct? All right. Well, what if there wasn't a 16 there? What if instead of there being a 16 there, what if there was a minus 3? What if it said minus 3 is equal to 0? Now what would you do? Well, what you could do is you could make the minus 3 a 16. How? Well, what would I need to add to negative 3 in order to make it a positive 16? Okay, well, I'd have to add 19. If I add 19 to negative 3, I'll have 16. Now, if I add 19 to this side, it's an equation. So that means I'd have to go over here and add 19 to the other side too, right? Okay, so this now would become x squared plus 8x plus 16 is equal to 19. Now we can complete the square, or we can factor this with in a binomial squared, and it would become x plus 4 squared, which is now equal to 19. Now, doesn't it look like the same thing we would do when we extract a square root, right? So we're going to take the square root of this side and the square root of this side, and we're now going to have x plus 4 is equal to the square root of 19, plus or minus the square root of 19, right? Don't forget the plus or minus. Then we're going to subtract 4 from both sides, and we would have x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 19, which would become x is equal to negative 4 plus the square root of 19, and x is equal to negative 4 minus the square root of 19. So those are our two answers. Okay? Let me come up with another one here for you. Okay, I've got another one here for you. I've got x squared minus 14x plus 5. So we're going to complete the square on this one. Okay? Now I want to show you a technique that you can use. Let's say you're not sure what to put here. You're not sure what to add or subtract in order to make sure you get the number that you want. Well, what you can do if you want is you could just automatically move this to the other side, so that now you have x squared minus 14x equals negative 5. And you'll note I left some space here. Now what would you like to be here in order to do a binomial squared? Well, what's half of negative 14? Negative 7, right? Okay, so because we divide this by 2, you get negative 7. If we square that, what's negative 7 times negative 7? 49, positive 49. So we're going to put a plus 49 here, and if we put a plus 49 there, we have to also add 49 to the other side, in which case we now have this becomes, if we factor it, x minus 7 squared equals negative 5 plus 49 is 44. And now we do the square root of both sides. And we get x minus 7 equals plus or minus. Now the square root of 44 can actually be reduced. The square root of 44 is the same thing as the square root of 4 times the square root of 11, because 4 times 11 is 44. And the square root of 4 is 2. So really what we're going to put here is 2 and the square root of 11. Now when we add 7 to both sides, we will have x is equal to 7 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 11. And so that means our two answers are x is equal to 7 plus 2 square root 11, and x is equal to 7 minus 2 times the square root of 11. And that's completing the square. Okay, I've got another one here. Why don't you pause the video and see if you can figure this one out on your own. Okay, so I want to remind you that sometimes the problem isn't always given to us like this. Sometimes it has a whole bunch of mess. And our first step is always to move everything to one side so that the quadratic is equal to 0. And this has been done in advance for us. Okay? Now, looking at this, what number would we like to have here? Well, if we go over here, half of 2 is 1. And what is 1 squared? 1 squared is 1. So we would like to have a plus 1 here, but we don't. We have a negative 5. Well, how can we turn a negative 5 into a positive 1? Well, we can add 6. So if we add 6 here, it'll become positive 1. And if we add 6 there, we have to add 6 to the other side. So now we'll have x squared minus 2x plus 1 is equal to 6. Now we can factor this as a binomial squared, and it becomes x minus 1 squared, which is equal to 6. Now we can extract the square root. We do the square root of this side and the square root of this side, and we get x minus 1 is equal to the square root of 6, but it's actually plus or minus the square root of 6, right? And then we'll add 1 to both sides, and we'll have x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 6. So our two answers are x is equal to 1 plus the square root of 6, and x is equal to 1 minus the square root of 6. And that's how we solve quadratic equations, by completing the square. Note that you can well, it's not true, you can't only do it, but it's very difficult to do it if the middle term is not an even number. If the middle term is an odd number, you may want to try a different technique. You could do it, but it's very difficult. If the middle term is an even number, though, you've got a good shot at solving by completing the square.